things off here. Thank you everybody for tuning in today. We appreciate the time that you're giving us for SAGA's next technical webinar held in conjunction with Genomics. Also featured in our technical webinar today will be representation from NewTek and Cordax. We have Cameron Snow, Jorge Villamontes, and Adam Starduella. It's a really solid lineup. I hope you get a lot of value out of this. The moderator for today's talk is Bob Barbae from Integrated Energy Services, and I'll give you a little bit of a rundown about Bob. What about Bob? Well, he's a 38-year practical experienced petroleum industry engineer as an open hole wireline guy, with being a product development manager, a petrophysicist, and completions optimization advisor who focuses on integrated reservoir characterization studies, completion optimization, rock mechanics analysis, horizontal well field development projects. He's got extensive experience in both conventional and unconventional reservoirs. Bob's a recognized authority on log-derived rock mechanics. He served as an expert witness for BP through Kirkland and Ellis in the Macondo trial. He received the Regional Formation Evaluation Award for the Society of Petroleum Engineers, Southwest North American region in the Permian Basin, May of 2018. And he served as a distinguished lecturer for the SPE in 1995 to 96 on the optimization of completion designs using petrophysical and reservoir engineering inputs. Bob's a recognized industry expert on refracturing rock mechanics and practices, and he delivered the keynote address at a major refracturing conference for the SPE in Calgary in June 2016. And I suppose I should give an intro on myself. Most of you from looking at the list know who I am, but I'm John Thompson. I'm the president of SAGA Wisdom, SAGA being a startup in the oil and gas industry focused on digital training. And that's probably enough about me. I'm a reservoir engineer trying to get a lot out of a petrophysics discussion. So this should be fun for me. With that, Bob, take it away.
Yeah, thank you, John. We're going to kind of focus today on the webinar on maximizing value from petrophysical data. We've got 3 excellent speakers lined up for this to go through some of the details here. All right. First thing is, what's the point of petrophysics? You know, you're really trying to accurately describe reservoir and fluid properties. You're trying to identify intervals within a well log that are capable of fluid flow. You know, where's your production coming from? And then lastly, probably the more important one is get an indication of predictor of reservoir performance. You know, what not only is it going to be productive, but how productive in terms of exact reserves. What can you expect for EURs, especially in areas where you don't have good well control? It's one of the primary values is EURs ahead of the bit. And all the techniques we'll be talking about today are going to be, you know, that's the end result of what we're looking at there. This came out of Stratus Advisors a couple of years ago. You know, it can take 4 more top producing wells to cover the sunk costs and lack of cash flow to a single poor well. And, you know, basically it's an advertisement for trying to go in and do your homework, do your petrophysical homework, do your studies, figure out where the oil in place is. You know, because the stakes are pretty high here. You know, your well costs in the Permian, or even though they've dropped somewhat, you're still looking at around $6 million a well. Some areas of the world, it's as high as $10 million, like in mid-continent. So it's a strong case for complete petrophysical analysis of all prospective areas versus just going in there and finding out with a bit or following other operators. One of the problems we run into all the time in these studies is you don't really know how operators are completing their wells. They may have very low cluster efficiencies, and you might have a completely inaccurate result. You know, so the petrophysics is really going to be providing a baseline for that, to where you don't have to rely on how good the other operators are in completing their wells and able to analyze what the potential is. So getting accurate oil and gas in place estimates, which is really the end result of all these talks we're talking about, and also your drainage heights, you know, and the associated recovery factors, which I'm going to throw a few slides in on that, tied with best practice completion techniques, gives you a pretty strong predictive tool to where you can go into an area that doesn't have much well control and optimize the development of your organic shales, which is the primary focus today. This was an interesting well from the Eagle Ford. It shows the importance of SRV. They actually got a pressure monitor well 70 feet away and showed that basically the original Gen 1 frac with 50-foot cluster spacing only drained 7.5 feet. So this is a very important slide, because basically it says that if you don't frac it, it doesn't produce, or it produces very little. So if you don't have close cluster spacing and high cluster efficiency, your results are going to be completely different from those that have, you know, wider cluster spacing. So you really can't use offset production as a go-by. You got to really base it on what's in the reservoir and what the recovery factor is. not looking at what other people are doing, because you don't know how other people did it. And a lot of times, most of the rocks or most of the wells we look at recently don't really do a very good job of optimizing. Recovery factors are important. We're going to talk about how to get oil in place distribution, but how do you convert that into EURs? Well, here's some numbers that came out of a recent ERTEC paper that we presented. We're getting really close. The thing about it, getting closer and closer on clusters, you're getting more and more like emulating a conventional tight reservoir. Tight oil, typically 15%. We're getting close to that. Gas, 70 to 80%. We're getting close to that. Condensate, kind of in the middle. So that's where we can take, this is the methodology to take the numbers that we get from these studies and these methodologies to actually oil coming out of the ground. So, and there's a result from the ERTEC paper as well, showing that cluster spacing is very important. So you really can't compare 50-foot, 40-foot, 30-foot cluster spacing production results with ones that are closer than that, because they're just not going to be as good. You're not going to get as much rock. You can actually count on a lower recovery factor. The little red dot to the right it should convince you that. That's the actual results, and it's right on trend with the study that came out of University of Lands. So, basically, how has petrophysics evolved? It's more quantitative. It's not, I remember when I was a Schlumberger, I'd do a lot of analysis saying probable hydrocarbons, probable water, high water cut, high oil cut, these really vague, numbers that were good, but I think people need more than that. When you're going to spend $6 to $10 million on a well, you probably want to have a little better handle on what's going on downhole. So your calibrations are important. Calibrating to real data and calibrating to production data is important. The paper that Jorge put together. And then, integration is very, very important, and there's a ton of data as well that Cameron's going to talk about. One of the biggest problems we have right now is almost too much data. What do? You're like drinking through a fire hose sometimes on what's coming out of these wells. So that's part of the issues. So what it means is, you can have a lot more of an impact, but it also means you got to come up and get new techniques to be able to deliver that. Because it gets a lot more labor intensive, a lot more time intensive, just a lot more data intensive. So, really going from single well to multi-wells, what we're talking about, because, typically one well doesn't define a reservoir. You really need to map it with multiple points. So you need to come up with a methodology for that. Get a good workflow, get your reservoir properties nailed down, evaluate your reservoir fluids, and basically get a high quality work product that's good enough. Perfect at the expense of good is a big issue here. And that's so you want to make sure it's good, but perfection may come at a high price. So you may not get a perfect answer, but that's what we're going to talk about today. So, basically, once you get in there, you can apply this once you get a solid workflow put together, which we'll talk about here in talks. You'll get something you can work and get a good quality data product there, the product that's going to tell you what to do to be able to make intelligent decisions on this. So, and integrating with other disciplines, what's the level of accuracy? Do you need it down to the fourth decimal point, or, is close good enough? In a lot of cases, just for scoping, you may not need to get down to that level of uncertainty. Plus, you've also got issues with the data. You can clean up data only so much. There's a lot of times you're at the mercy of what came out of the ground. So, kind of conclude my introduction, the ideal asset team for maximizing asset value. We kind of touch on this in the talks. The petrophysicist is in there. What's the OIP, gas in place? Geologist, how's it distributed laterally? Reservoir engineer, his inputs. Completion engineer, there's their inputs. So basically, you need a real team to integrate the disciplines effectively to optimize your completions in organic shale. You really need all these disciplines participating. And I think everybody's seen that within their companies. Well, the problem is when you actually go out there to complete these wells, what do you get? Well, you get a reproduction engineer, not a production engineer, and a frac service company engineer. And the same thing goes in petrophysics sometimes. If they'll look at offset wells and say, well, they completed their well here, let's complete our well there. Or they completed the well in this area, let's put our well in this area. It's doing the actual homework on this is very, very important. And I think that's something we'll talk about more here, particularly when it comes to multi-well projects. And the petrophysics, again, kind of self-serving, but it's a very critical discipline to optimizing these production results. We find that when we get in these integrated studies, that usually the petrophysics is the quarterback of the team. They're the ones that provide the information that everybody else needs. Everybody's pulling on your inputs to be able to do theirs right. So hopefully it's important to everybody else as well. Okay, so the question is, how do you maximize value from the petrophysics in this new data-heavy world? More sophistication, more interpretation, more integration. And I think that'll be a good lead-in to Cameron's talk, the infrastructure for multi-well interpretations. Cameron's a geologist and petrophysicist with 15 years of experience in the oil and gas industry. He's got global experience with a strong focus work in conventional organic shale plays. He's a co-founder of Dynamics.com, a cloud-based petrophysics platform. He leads the subsurface development of the software. Prior to Dynamics, he worked as a manager of North American new ventures for Apache, followed by several positions in the UK. And he has a PhD in geology from Stanford University and a master's from Imperial College. So very, very impressive resume there, Cameron. So take it away.
All right. Thank you for that introduction, Bob. Okay, so what I'm going to be talking to you about is essentially kind of a how-to guide for multi-well petrophysics, and then we're going to try and cement in the importance of doing multi-well petrophysics with a case study from the Powder River Basin. So in terms of what I'm going to go over in this talk, I'm going to start off with a little bit of information or context on how I view single well versus multi-well petrophysics. Then we're going to talk about some of the project prerequisites before you get started with a multi-well interpretation. And then we're going to look at the special place that data prep and conditioning and parameter selection have in these types of studies. And then we're going to wrap that up with a brief case study from the Powder River Basin where we were looking at the impact of petrophysics on EUR prediction. All right. Just a little bit of context. When I talk about single well and multi-well petrophysics, I'll be throwing these terms around a bit. What I specifically mean when I say single well petrophysics is this extremely detailed interpretation that we do that's generally performed by a petrophysical specialist. And this is that interpretation where we strive for petrophysical sophistication and perfection. So we go in, we make sure all the data is ready to be interpreted, doing a lot of manual tweaks on it. We closely scrutinize all the parameters and we try to get very good calibration of the core and fluid data that we have available. If it's an important well, like a pilot well, we'll often have access to data like NMR and MRI that we can use to get a deeper interpretation. And this type of interpretation isn't an easy one to do. It often takes a couple of days. It's a very specialist type of interpretation. And because of that, it becomes difficult to scale this up unless you have a very singular focus on interpreting wells or have a dedicated team that's continuously working on generating petrophysical interpretations. And even then, when projects move from tens of wells to hundreds of wells to thousands of wells, it becomes almost impossible to continue with this type of petrophysics. On the opposite end of the spectrum of this, we have what I would refer to as bulk log calculations. And these are typically when we choose a limited set of equations, such as like a V-shell from gamma ray and a density porosity. We apply those broadly across a data set. And, there's generally no, a specific calibration for any given well. Often the wells, all have common parameters that are shared between them. And a lot of times this is the type of work that you'll see done by non-specialists and typically, the G&G staff, just because they're working in the mapping packages where the log data is available to them. And a lot of this is just driven by the fact that the tools and methods that we should be using just weren't built into to the mapping packages that are available to them. And so, when I see this type of interpretation done, and sometimes it does make me a little uneasy. And the reason why is, when you do a generic bulk log calculation, you get a generic outcome. And if you're trying to solve more and more advanced problems, I would question the value of this type of analysis. Now, somewhere in the middle of these is what I would call multi-well petrophysics. And this is when we try to do a more detailed petrophysical interpretation, but instead of manually conditioning data and repairing data, we try to leverage automation when possible. When we're trying to select parameters, we try to inform that parameter selection with spatial data like maps and statistics. and do this in ways that scale up and in ways that are consistent with our regional knowledge. We still want to be calibrated if and when possible. But instead of using and leveraging some of those specialty logs that may give us a more detailed answer, we're going to try and utilize some of these commonly available logs. And the impetus behind that is we want to be able to apply this interpretation broadly. And so really kind of the process that we use, and while I'm going through this, kind of keep this in mind, is you're creating a blueprint of your interpretation. And then we're going to apply that blueprint broadly across the basin or across our area of interest. So when you look at this, you've really got a spectrum where on one end you've got the single well petrophysics, where the clouds have opened and you're really illuminating in as much detail as possible, versus the repetitive bulk log calculation where everything is kind of done in a cookie cutter fashion. And in general, for my guide on where I want to put in my effort, it depends on the amount of capital that's at stake. And so, if I think about, something like a deep water conventional well or a pilot well on a pad where I'm going to drill 10 horizontals off of it, I in that situation, I want to put in the time and effort to get this petrophysical perfection when possible. And if I'm doing some, very high level scoping work, I may go with bulk log calculations. But a lot of my day-to-day, and probably a lot of yours, is going to be spent, evaluating things like leasing decisions and infill drilling locations and, completions evaluations and lookbacks. And in those cases, this is where I think multi-well petrophysics is very well suited, because you can really customize the level of detail and sophistication that you need. So if we just do a side-by-side of single well petrophysics and multi-well petrophysics, they're very similar. We identify a workflow, we do some data prep and conditioning, we do parameter selection, generate results, QC those. Really the difference is how we are targeting value creation with these. With single well petrophysics, we're trying to have a very targeted business impact, typically on specific wells or on a specific pad or a small area. Where with multi-well petrophysics, we're going to have this distributed impact, and what the hope is there is that cumulative impact will be able to create significant value in the long run. And this is not an either-or decision. One of the reasons that I encourage companies to try and do multi-well petrophysics is it serves as a way of creating space so their petrophysicists can go in and do that focused value creation that requires their full expertise. So yeah, those are, when I think about single well and multi-well petrophysics, that's how I view it. So now that I've given you that context, let's look at some of the prerequisites before you start one of these projects. So there are a few key things, such as the stratigraphic framework, understanding data availability, understanding spatially varying project properties that you need before you start this, before you start these interpretations. And the reason why is because these will affect how you do the interpretation. First of all, if you're a geoscientist, you should be supplying your petrophysicist with a consistent, well-defined stratigraphic framework. This is key to being able to get an apples-to-apples analysis across a large area. And if you don't have this, you will, you'll spend a lot more time on the back end doing QC work to try to square up your results. With respect to data inventory, so when you start working with large numbers of wells, that means you're going to have inconsistent data suites from well to well. And so you need to understand that variability, and you need to ask yourself, are certain logs absolutely required for my analysis? Or can I do without those? And how does not having that data available, how does that affect the reliability or the range of uncertainty that's on my interpretation? And this is something that it's actually very difficult to quantify, and there are no kind of rule of thumbs that you can put on this. It varies quite a bit from project to project in my experience. One of the key things in multi-well petrophysics is understanding how parameters vary spatially. And there are a lot of parameters that vary quite substantially, things like water salinity, gas-oil ratio, geothermal gradient, maturity. These all vary spatially. And if you do not account for this, this is going to lead to your analysis being less and less accurate with each step where you ignore a parameter that that varies spatially. And this is really the bane of doing bulk log calculations. So in a simple example, if you think about calculating, volumetrics, if you don't have, if you're not taking into account GOR variability, you're going to end up miscalculating your oil and gas in place, for example. So there are very concrete, simple examples that can really highlight the importance of bringing these parameters in. And finally, it's always important, because as a petrophysicist, even inside of a company, you have customers. Those customers are, the reservoir engineers, the completion engineers, and the geologists. And it's important that, when working with petrophysicists, that, you very clearly define what's needed early in the project. And the reason why is because, if you just need the basic set of outputs, the petrophysicist may take one approach, whereas if you need a much more specialized product with things like, synthetic shear logs and rock strength properties and effective stresses, they may take an entirely different approach to it. So it's important to understand this before you really get started on a project. Okay, so with that said, we've now covered the prerequisites. We're ready to start our project. So the first thing before we start interpretation, we need our data to be interpretation ready. So for me, this means three things. We have to do data preconditioning. We have to optionally some log normalization, and we need to go in and do some bad hole identification and repair. And for me, I like to think about it in terms of a 4C framework. So our data needs to be clear. It needs to be clear what it is. It needs to be consistent with respect to units and lithological references. It needs to be as complete as possible through aliasing and compositing multiple logging runs. And it needs to be clean, i.e., it needs to have representative data ranges and log responses. So for those of you that have worked a lot with log data, none of this is going to strike you as surprising, but there are a lot of challenges with it. And I really split these challenges into two parts. There's the structural problems with log data, for example, curve mnemonics, unit differences, different lithological references, and these are all significant when working on large projects. And then there are the second class of problems, which are those where the log response or the data that you have is not representative of the subsurface. So that would be things like washouts, variations in tool response from vendor to vendor, or poor digitization in some cases. So this first group, these are logistical challenges. And I would strongly argue that if you put some forethought into this and are rigorous about it, you can address most of this through automation. And with the second tranche of problems, these are interpretation problems. You are starting to move into the realm of doing your interpretation, but I think these are things that can be addressed quite well at scale. So, like I said, it's a two-part problem, and so I think the solution involves a couple of discrete steps. I have an entire presentation on data attributes, which I'm happy to share if you suffer from insomnia. So I'm not going to go into that in a lot of detail, but I will offer some general guidance on this, which is take the time upfront in your project to, do, a substantial amount of curve aliasing. You need to have between 5,000 and 7,500 curve mnemonics in your alias tables to capture between 90 and 95% of the data. You need to spend a lot of time focusing on curve units and making sure that everything is in the same unit space and that everything is has been converted to the same lithological reference. And in order to do this, you need to be very granular in your data preconditioning. So, definitely be a splitter in this case because you can always lump things together later. The second part of this is focused on data quality. So we're going to cover this in two parts. The first part is log normalization, which will address the scale of the data. And the second part is focused on washout, so identifying and repairing bad hole. So when it comes time to do log normalization, you should absolutely do it if it helps you with well-to-well correlation. However, the other time to do it is when it helps you with variations due to tool generation, vendor, etc. When you shouldn't normalize is don't normalize when it results in losing geological information, and don't do it to fix bad data. That's an entirely separate step. And I would argue that the most important rule of normalization is just to understand how it is modifying your data. So there are a few different ways you can do normalization. You can do things like a simple shift, which moves your data higher or lower. You can do simple stretching and squeezing exercises, or you can do 3-point operations, which are asymmetrical scaling approaches. And then you can also choose whether or not to do relative scaling or fixed value scaling. And the easiest way to think about these is for something like relative scaling, imagine aligning the average of all of your SP curves, for example, or think about scaling your gamma ray from 0 to 100. And so those are examples of both relative and fixed scaling, respectively. So for data normalization, QC is very important. So I just want to briefly touch on this. So the way I personally do it is I generate my property average maps zone by zone, inspect the quality of those. And let's say I see what I think is some inconsistency that's not caused by the subsurface. I choose a method and apply that scaling. And then, we are left with a resultant map. And in this case, it looks much smoother, and we've eliminated some of these large discrepancies. However, like I said, you don't want to normalize away geology. You don't want to wash out the subsurface, so to say. And so, what are things you can look for? Have your wells all, been shifted in one direction or another? If every zone in a well, needs to be shifted higher, that's a good sign that your normalization has worked. However, if you start seeing patterns on a map from your normalization, that means you're probably trying to impinge on geology. So in this example here on the top right, the approximate strike in this area is given by the dashed red line, and we can see that everything here to the northwest has been shifted higher, and everything to the southeast has been shifted lower. And since that is a shift that's consistent with the geology, I would argue that we are normalizing away geology in this case. So we might want to take a different approach. So once you've normalized your data, you're going to go in and look at doing bad hole ID and repair. So it's a 3-step process. Step 1, identify where the logs are bad. Step 2, recognize what logs are still good in those zones. And step 3, reconstruct the data in some method or another. And if you don't do this, you're going to end up with overly optimistic porosities. That's just the way life is, unfortunately. So, let's talk about flagging bad hole. Rule of thumb, when doing single well analysis, is the caliper is an excellent, source of truth if something is washed out or not. However, when you're working with hundreds or potentially even thousands of wells, caliper becomes troublesome because, different wells have different bit sizes, logging runs and casing runs at different depths, etc. So caliper becomes very hard to use. So you need to use something like borehole rugosity instead. You also need to take advantage of the logs themselves and use things like density correction logs or cutoffs on the density values themselves. And then once you've flagged it, you can go in and you can do that repair. You can either do it via things like simple correlations, like the Gardner relation between density and sonic. You can use machine learning, which is the approach we use in dynamics. or you can, do something like interpolation from a 3D model. And if you look at the example here, we have two very obviously washed out zones here in this well in the Alston Chalk. And if we look at the average porosity for that zone before and after we repaired bad hole, we see that porosities were on the order of 13.5 to 14%. After we did the correction, they were more in line with what we expect, which is about 6.5 or 7%. And that type of difference, is the difference between going in and wasting a lot of time and potentially wasting capital chasing an imaginary sweet spot and realizing that something is just an average looking area. So at this point, our data is interpretation ready, and we're ready to go in and really start making those interpretations. And so that means, let's go in and do some parameter evaluation. So as I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of parameters that vary spatially, and we have to capture this in our evaluations if we're doing a multi-well interpretation. And this is just quite simply where most quote bulk log calculations fall over. And even if you've decided to take this multiple single well approach where you do detailed interpretations well by well, it can start to become very cumbersome to make sure that all your interpretations are consistent between wells, which is why I like taking this more holistic view of things. So we're going to go over 4 techniques to help you think about pulling parameters and populating your project with them. So the first way to do this is parameter extrapolation. So basically we take a map and you retrieve a value from that map and you use that to populate your parameters on a zone by zone basis. And you could even go in and do this, for example, on a 3D cube. You could go extract values in a 3D cube if you had that available. This is great because it allows you to integrate data sets and interpretations that were made by other experts. And it allows you to fill in the gaps when there's a lot of sparse data. So, if you think about something like a maturity map, we only have a few points here in this county, but if we drill a well right here, we think we have a pretty good idea of, of what our parameters should be. A close cousin to that is parameter interpolation. So, this is where we go in and we start, interpreting a few wells by hand. And then if the boundary conditions accurately define what's going on inside of this area, then we can triangulate a solution for that. The positive to this is the more interpretations you make, the more granular your interpolation becomes. However, the downside of this is that, if your boundary conditions aren't defining it, then it's going to be tricky to do this. Third way is something that we call parameter remapping in genomics. And this is trying to identify the style in which a petrophysicist makes an interpretation. So you go in, you generate a bunch of statistics, and you map your parameter selection to that distribution. And then you go in and remap that for subsequent wells. So the easiest way to look at this is as an example. So in this well, which is my key well, I interpreted the Alston Chalk to have endpoints on my gamma ray interpretation of 16 and 195. I told it to remap the parameters, and the software automatically goes in and says, oh, the equivalent pick based on the statistics would be 15 and 190. And this is something that you can really think of as being the inverse of normalization. So you can, instead of manipulating the data, you are manipulating your parameters instead. And finally, the last way that I see people trying to assign parameters is, if you have an independent log, like let's say a facies log that was calculated via some clustering algorithm, you could go in and be very prescriptive and say, hey, if the facies is equal to this, then I want my row matrix equal to that. If it otherwise, give me this. That can work quite well if you have high confidence in your input logs, but it can also become very prescriptive if you have a lot of different categories of data. So those are 4 ways that you can, think about assigning parameters in a way that scales up and honors regional knowledge. All the methods that we're using are the same. It's just that we're trying to populate our project in a different way. So I want to just very briefly share a case study with you from the Powder River Basin that will hopefully cement home the value of doing this. So in this study, we were asked to do some EUR prediction. So independently established EURs were calculated for a large group of wells, and we wanted to examine the uplift from taking increasingly sophisticated petrophysical approaches. So when we started this, we had a geological framework. We had about 680 wells that had the logs that we needed to use in the workflow. And we also had a number of external property maps like maturity, GOR, et cetera. And we also had the well metadata with this. And we went in, we tested three things. We did basic cutoffs mapping, where we just put a cutoff on the gamma ray density and resistivity. Then we went in and were slightly more sophisticated and did a bulk log calculation. And then finally, we went in and did a more advanced multi-well interpretation where we spatially varied all these parameters based on either maps, parameter remapping, or some conditional analyses. And we applied a full probabilistic workflow, including mineral inversion. So when we look at the results, what we see is that, we were not able, using either a cutoffs or a bulk log calculation, to predict the results of any single well with much confidence. On a program basis, yes, we were closer, but I would argue that this is a very limited value to an operator. However, when we went in and we did a more sophisticated analysis, we were able to substantially reduce the uncertainty on the EUR prediction for any given single well, and we were able to come very close to the results on a program basis. So when analyzing multiple wells at a time. We then went in and we decided to add one more layer of sophistication on top of this, where we automatically calculated pore pressure, looked at reservoir continuity, and then evaluated stimulated rock volume. And in doing this, we were once again able to tighten the results to what you see down here on the lower right in this scatter plot. And we were able to substantially reduce the uncertainty in EUR prediction in the Niobrara formation. It took a little bit more time. It took a little bit of integration with completions experts, but I would say that it was well worth it. And that is it for my talk. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Cam. Kind of the first question, Cam, I've got, if you run into issues with resistivity normalization, sometimes we see tools that are not really optimized as far as the chlorides and the resistivity profiles, inductions in salt mud and ladder logs and fresh mud and the like. How do you typically deal with that?
Yeah, so that can be that's one of the trickier logs to normalize. A couple of tips for normalizing resistivity in general. First of all, I find it's often quite useful to linearize the resistivity, then apply the normalization and scaling, and then convert that back to log space. That typically gives a somewhat better result. The other thing is, you can, this is where relative scaling becomes more important as well. So if you think about normalizing to a fixed range, that is, that can be dangerous if you have wells that are miscalibrated. But if you're doing relative scaling, where you're shifting wells relative to another, as long as you properly choose your key well that you're, that the target wells are normalizing to, it works better. That's still, resistivity is one of the most difficult logs to normalize, just due to the nature of it and due to the fact that it's not only dependent on the rock, it's also dependent on the fluids as well, as you know.
Right. Yeah, we've kind of played around with using BBW in the organics since they've got BBI, but I'm not sure if that's good or bad. I wasn't sure what you thought of that concept. Because if you know your BBI and you're in a certain rock type, that may be something you can back into, the BBW, not normalized resistivity, but the BBW. I'm not sure if that's a good way to go or not. I'm asking more than telling.
Yeah. Okay, so I see a couple more questions that I'll answer
Yeah.
before I turn it over to the next talk. So one, I see that geologist Rucker asked, and he asked about 3D interpolation and how do we approach this, and have we found a useful mathematical tool to handle things like thickness changes, for example. So, um, yeah, probably the go-to tool in the industry for 3D interpolation would be going to something like Petrel, and trying to use like a geostatistical approach to distribute stuff. If you're looking at more like what I call a 2.5D interpolation, which would be interpreting between a small handful of wells, mathematically, I think something like dynamic time warping, which allows you to map each depth step to another depth step in an adjacent series, is probably the best way to go about that. And as you push that time warping correlation out to additional wells, you can start averaging the response or weighting that by distance or some other parameter. But 3D interpolation, if you don't already have some type of fully propagated model, you're going to have to write something custom yourself, probably using some type of dynamic time warping algorithm. Hopefully that answers that. And there's another question from Nicole Frichette. About how we accounted for stimulated rock volume in our volumetric estimation. Yeah, so this was one of the things that was that required a lot of back and forth, with the completions expert that we were dealing with on this particular project. And so it was a multi-step process where we went in, we identified, first of all, it was key to identify the landing zone for these wells as best we could. And then we did a lot of work on the rock properties, rock strength properties. We did a full simulation of the shear log across the basin. So then we could get to rock strength properties. We looked at the effective stresses, so we could have a full geomechanical model for the basin. And then we worked with the completions engineer to set criteria based on an average, frac job on how much, height growth and half length we could expect. So it was still a bit generic, but that is the approach that we took to calculate a volume around each of our point interpretations, so to speak.
Okay. That looks like all the questions. Well, thank you, Cam. Appreciate it. Very good talk. All right. Our next speaker will be Jorge Villamontes. Jorge is currently the EVP and Chief Operating Officer at NewTek. Prior to NewTek, Jorge had several reservoir engineering positions with Shell, working West Africa, and for QRI, working the Cantarell project for Pemex. He has a PhD in experimental physics from Brown University. Very impressive resume, Jorge. With that, I'll turn it over to Jorge. It's all yours.
All right. Well, thank you, Bob, and thank you, Cam, for such a good presentation. I think it leads pretty well into what my presentation is about. And it's a pretty winded title, but the main idea is being able to use production data to improve the petrophysical model. Because the idea is that production tells you a lot more about the reservoir that sometimes is given credit for. So I'll go here to the next slide. And this work came about from quite a bit of consulting work that we perform in-house, and we would take the petrophysical interpretation, integrate it along with fracture modeling, and then go about trying to history match wells for clients and be able to then forecast different development scenarios, and then trying to come up with what should the optimum spacing be and landing depths and so forth. And we repeatedly kept running into problems where, especially in the Delaware, it was very difficult to match the historical production from dynamic modeling because many of these wells had very low initial water separation, somewhere around 20%, yet the water cuts were, for the most part, around between 70 and 80%. And here is the pictures here is just an area in Reeves County for one of the clients at the time, and we looked around the water cuts for historical wells in this area, and the 50th percentile is really quite high, and it was very representative of mostly what we saw. And then all the way on the right is basically showing the low water separation in these wells, and it was just very difficult to basically reconcile production with the petrophysics. Especially in the Wolfgang Formation, it wasn't just in the areas that we initially worked for clients. This is really all over the place. I think it's something that's pretty well known at the moment. And at the time, there were even discussions of, well, it's probably coming from some sort of natural fractures, but we still had a hard time reconciling this, because we couldn't really see a large water leg that this water could be coming from. And the idea is that you would like to start with the end in mind. And as Cam mentioned, is what are the outputs that you want? And as we've been talking a lot, it all starts with the petrophysics. The petrophysics sets not just the rock parameters, but also it should provide a guidance on what the bound, not just the initial separations, but the bound separations. And these bound separations are extremely important because they scale the relative permeability curves, which is something I'll talk about next. And it's very important because that, in a sense, leads into the expected water cuts, because in most of this resource rock development, the separations can change appreciably because it's pressure depletion drive, not water flooding or some other types of production drives. And along with the hydraulic fractures, it all gets put together into a dynamic model. In this case, what I'm showing is a box model, and this is the typical workflow that we've done thousands of. Which is, if you have a log, you can, and anybody, with the right package and mechanization, you can build these box models, and then you can put the fractures either as complex planar fractures, like you see here on the lower left, or as just standard rectangular looking hydraulic fractures that are actually very helpful in order to try to constrain the answers or give you a feeling for the answer. But at the end, it all must come together to explain production. Because if we're not able to explain production, which we could argue is the most truthful thing we probably know, that is coming out of the reservoir, then we're not doing our job as petroleum engineers. A big part of the petrophysics is not just providing the initial separations. That's very important, and porosity, permeability, and the other different parameters that are used in order to set up the reservoir models. But a big part of it is the bound separations. And Bob kept mentioning BVI, bulk volume irreducible. That's an important one because that sets the irreducible separation for water, but also is the irreducible separation for oil. And what we found out is that in order to generate a history match for pretty much all the consulting projects that we were doing for clients in the Delaware, especially in the Wolfgang Formation, we had to skew the well-formed curves massively towards the low separations. In a sense, we had to build in a large amount of irreducible oil in the rock in order to make it work. And the way that you can rationalize this is that the way that the pore structure looks, and this is a scanning electron micrograph from Ali Tini, we have pore structures that are surrounded by organic matrix, organic content. You have pore structures that are basically inorganic minerals, and then you have pretty much everywhere in between. Some of these pores are isolated. Basically, they're stranded, they don't form part of the connected pore space, and others are, right? Overall, the way that the pore space is typically segmented is you have your bound water, your stranded oil, then you have and stranded water too, right? Could be both ways, and then bound oil. And then by what I mean by bound is I mean capillary bound, right? Not necessarily stranded in the sense that it cannot move. Effective, basically part of the effective pore space. And then we have the movable oil and the movable water, which form part is really the only portion of the pore space that is able to move and make it to the well and then eventually to the surface. And that's without being able to properly segment the complete pore space and take into account the bounds, it provides basically a convoluted answer it provides a convoluted framework for trying to answer the production. It is, as I mentioned before, it is very important to obtain some guidance from Petrophysics in terms of what the reproducible hydrocarbon separations are. And this is a large portion of POC, thermal maturity, and a number of different petrophysical parameters. But you can see that at the same water separation, about 40-some% that I'm highlighting here, in a high permeability siltstone, it would be somewhere around 8. It would be around 18%, while with the proper scaling in an organic mudstone, the same separation would provide an 80% water cut. And all that has, it's very important to be able to have the right well-formed scaling in order to match production. The workflow that we have taken in order to basically do this en masse as multi-well petrophysics, as Cam has discussed before, it's actually somewhat similar to Cam's approach. And I haven't taken the time here to explain some of the prerequisites that you need, which are very important. Like Cameron mentioned, the number one being you need to have structural consistency. And this is important because without structural consistency, you cannot allocate in production to the right formation. And you cannot just in a place like the Delaware follow the operator filing for where they landed the well, and actually an exercise in doing that would quickly deal with very difficult bulk correlation to production because the wells are not properly landed in a consistent manner. The other is to have proper stratigraphy and zone marking, basically top identification. You need to have consistent tops because the physics and the way that you apply the models is for each formation, because you would like to think that is a certain depositional environment. The workflow that we used, basically, we collect massive amounts of production data, pretty much all the production data that is available at the time. We use the deviation surveys of every one of those producers, and the image here just shows somewhere in the Delaware where we can show a view, and you can see how those have been now projected in 2 dimensions. Cameron mentioned about the ability of doing this dimensionally. In order to do that, you do need a 2-dimensional geologic model. But luckily for us, we're in the business of building regional studies, so that's one of the benefits of it. So, and the color in each of these trajectories means a different formation, either Wolfram A, Wolfram B, third bone, and so forth. And then for each of these wells, we do know what the 12 months water cut is. And the idea is you would like to establish a water cut that is stable in the well. And for the most part, that's exactly what we see. And then we basically propagate this water cut throughout the geological model in a similar way as we propagated the other physical properties. And why this is done? Well, as Cameron mentioned, this is done so that then you can use that grid to query properties where you don't have a producer, but you do have a well in which you're interested in performing petrophysics. And then we then query that grid to every well that forms part of the regional study. And now we have now basically we have a property which is expected water cut as a function of the other petrophysical properties, and now we have a way that we can scale, and we've done this through machine learning regression, and we can now be able to scale what the bound separations should be, and in a sense be able to generate the log that should explain better production. It is quite a tedious and massive amount of work to incorporate all this production data. And this is just another view of it, just when this work was done for the Delaware now it's version 3. But every one of these wells is placed in the 3-dimensional model. Every one of these wells has a expected water cut. And there's always ways to improve this workflow. We assume that the water cut was coming equally all the way along the trajectory of the well. But we all know that contribution to production changes along the wellbore. That was not taken here because we didn't really have any data to help constrain that. But you can see how you can always try to you have additional information to do a better job. And overall, what's the difference? So this is one well from version 2 to version 3. Version 2 basically does not involve this well point scaling to aim and describe what the water cut would be along the well, and in version 3, is basically what I'm trying to show you. And I know there's many tracks, but most of us sort of know the sequence, right? You have gamma ray, you have resistivity, then you have your neutron density porosities, and then your lithology tracks, and then the most important track is the track right after that, which is a combination of the effective porosity, and then how that porosity is divided up into bond hydrocarbons, which is shown as red, the movable hydrocarbons, which is shown as black, the movable water, which is shown as this light blue color, and then the darker blue teal is the bound water. The track right next to that is permeability, which shows good product that we provided, but now we're able to show what's the perm to water, right, or what the permeability to water is as a part of that complete bulk or absolute permeability. And if you're able to do that, then you're able to provide some sort of water cut, right? So what you can see is this golden curve is that it provides a measure for what the water cut would be. So when you don't see the gold color, that means 100% water, and then when you see some gold, it just shows gold money and so forth. But the more gold you see, the more propensity for hydrocarbon to flow. And that was just one way of doing it. And here's another explanation of it. This is it provides a good way to explain in a relative sense, which portions of the reservoir you would expect to contribute to hydrocarbon flow. But the ultimate test is always to put this into a dynamic model, and then be able to forecast what the history match what the production of the well is. And in order to properly do that, as pointed out, you do need some frac modeling, either minimum frac size or expected frac size or the highest one to try to bootstrap the answer, or proper Gopher or FracPro or any of these type of these software which in our part we really like Gopher as a beautiful CPU. But if we look at this in bulk, basically for all the wells that we have production, and on the x-axis is our prediction of EUR, and then on the vertical axis is the actual values. And this is also normalized by the pounds of proppant and the length of the well, and everything else. The rest is the physical properties that go into a neural network, which then is trained on the data set. And what we see is a significant R-square improvement from version 2, which does not include the bounce operations, to version 3, which does. And for all the wells, I believe this is every well in the Wolfcamp formation. Even if you don't remove outliers, which are highlighted in blue here, it goes from 0.59 to a 0.78 R-square, which is quite impressive. And if you remove sort of outliers, then it gets a little bit better of that. And the hope, right, is that production, taking production as a messenger of the not just the rock properties, right, that are typically described with standard petrophysical analysis, but also the fluid properties and how they're bound. Then you can really achieve a significant improvement in trying to forecast what the production could be. And that's my talk. I have a number of other slides, in the back, but I guess I'll try to, I'll only show those in the interest of time. If there's a question that warrants it. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Jorge. If we could go ahead and do the Q&A portion again. If you've got questions for Jorge, go ahead and put them in there. A very good talk, Jorge. It's been a constant challenge. The Delaware water cut's always been something I get a question on every operator I work with.
Yeah. So that the main motivation came from doing reservoir engineering work and integrating our petrophysics, which is what the company is known for, and then seeing that, oh my goodness, we cannot explain it.
The problem we typically run into on that is, based on that ingrain work, about 46% of the Wolfcamp is organic porosity, and the rest is granular. And you've got two radically different, BVIs. BVI in your organic 0 and BVI in your siltstone's 5. You're trying to mix apples and oranges.
Exactly. So this is the image that we had. When we were doing, this, when we started doing this work, is that we cannot really. A large portion of the pore space is actually, like that oil has not had a chance to connect yet. And there's other, I didn't include some work here that we've done because we have a laboratory as well. And we do quite a bit of high pressure mercury injection, inject mercury into rock samples up to 60,000 psi. And then we were doing all sorts of samples of different grind sizes. Typically, you grind down to, 25, 30. And then that's how sort of the industry and a lot of clients ask. But we start asking ourselves, what happens if we don't, if we don't grind it? What happens if we grind it to certain levels? And we saw that we could actually see the porosity increase, right? The amount of mercury we can inject into the rock increase after cleaning. And then, questions came about, how about cleaning? Are you doing the right level of cleaning? And then, we did cleaning for basically a month, right? And then 2 months after that, and we couldn't see significant increases in porosity unless we changed the grinding. But okay, I'll basically do it, if there is any questions that come up.
I guess the question I've got is something we looked at and really didn't have much success with, is trying to get some kind of facies based, organic content, where you've got higher organic porosity in certain zones versus other zones. I mean, other than just looking at your spectral gamma ray, for qualitative, or trying to do a multi-mineral.
Yeah.
We never really made much progress looking at that.
No, that's a tough one. So Cameron had a beautiful map of maturity, right? And it is very important, right? I mean, a large part of this work, which let's see where's my mouse, that I mentioned here is regional maturity modulation, and I call it that because it really is, right, in the sense that if you have a better understanding of maturity, you can markedly improve this result, right? And, that makes sense, right? If the rock is not mature, then, well, most of the oil is really stranded. It just cannot move. And so maturity, is a huge component of this work in terms of understanding. And we do spend quite a bit of work building the, you see here maturity map, right, that, we have. But being able to at the very least, two-dimensionally distribute these properties, as Cam has mentioned. And that's an aspect that we really love about the dynamics workflow. That's a huge help because you can see how these properties are distributed. I mean, you can get a better idea of how wrong you are, how off you are. So, yeah, that's
good.
And I hope it has served of some education and again that the idea of you must scale your work or your simulation model is not going to work in these cases.
Sure.
All right.
You've got a couple other questions here. And the first one, have you explored empirical forecasting results for production prediction using independent inputs such as petrophysical completion, development density, et cetera, compared to this full integrated model you've built?
So we have, right? And we tried a number of different empirical approaches. However, in pretty much all of them, right, we couldn't properly explain the extremely high water cut, over 70% water cut for years. It's not that it is I'll go back to it. This is months in production, right? I mean, it's not a fluke, it's not a flowback. It's not something that these wells produce massive amounts of water for this period of time, unless we really started combining. You get the same result with either empirical modeling or physical modeling like this, computerized finite element model. So, and they all point to the same type of direction. The reason why we basically focused on doing discrete reservoir modeling, especially in the CMG software packages, because we could integrate very specialized and complex hydraulic fracture results from the fracture modeling performed in Gopher, which is something that our clients really wanted to know, because it provided I'll go back to that. It provided a what they thought, actually, I think it might not be far from the truth, a good way to gauge recovery factors. You can gauge recovery factors by saying, well, it's always a hard one to bound because it depends what you assume as your initial holding place, right? That your well can pass. And the reason why we stuck to this process is because I can quickly perform volumetrics on the SRV, hence the grid blocks that are in contact or nearest neighbor to a hydraulic fracture, and include that as part of my initial holding place volumetrics in order to calculate recovery factors, so that we can always provide recovery factors that are consistent with the completion and stimulation.
Right.
So I guess my answer is, that's what clients sort of wanted, so we followed along.
Okay. One more question. I think both presentations illustrate the best way to define and or create additional GSAs as we develop one area. I'm sure what GSA is. Have you guys influenced or suggested additional data acquisition programs based on these results? And what do you think is more critical, the fluids, the geochemistry, pressures?
So something that the capillary pressure measurement, especially with mercury, because you could really inject into it. You go to extremely high pressure, and not just the intrusion part of the typical cap pressure, but also the extrusion, where now you actually you don't just go in steps with higher and higher pressure, but also you go in steps in lower and lower pressure. It gives you an idea of the volume of mercury, in a sense, the non-wetting phase, that will be left behind due to capillary forces. So that is your bound sort of, oil or bound non-wetting phase, depending on what you think the wettability would be here. So that's one that we have found, that the bound oil extremely correlates extremely well with the not just intrusion but extrusion mercury measurements. The other is maturity. Like I mentioned, maturity is extremely important, and it really, it controls a huge part of this process. Those are the ones that I can think of just like this, off the cuff. off the cuff of my just on the top of my head. One workflow. This works. I think this workflow works very well here, right? In the Delaware and in the Wolfgang. We try to apply it in other places where the client saw significant high water cuts, but if you can explain the water production through, for example, natural fractures where you do see a significant water leg, right? You shouldn't just disregard that as basically you're sort of making the assumption here that it's coming from the matrix, right? I mean, this is what this work is based on. Is you saying, well, the water is coming from the matrix. We don't see where the ocean is nearby, so where else is going to come from? But we've worked in many other projects where you sort of could pigeonhole yourself into it's coming from the matrix where it actually it isn't. But typically you would see that in the production because instead of having a relatively flat water cut, you see the water cut increase in time. Or for example, you start with a very very high water cut, and then the water cut decrease in time. This is typical depletion, right? Where now you start getting sufficiently pressure drop between the natural fracture system and the matrix. You start drawing the oil out of the matrix and getting higher recovery that way. But typically, you would see this from the production data. And really, the production is the messenger of the reservoir. I think that's a really good sort of thing to keep in mind.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Any further? I got the clarification. GSA is geologically similar areas. Thank you, Efren.
Okay.
Thought I had most of the alphabet soup down in the old passion. That's a new one.
Yeah.
Excellent. Any further questions for Jorge?
Well, thank you. Thanks everyone. Thank you, Bob.
Great.
I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Okay. Sounds good. Yeah, our next speaker, Adam Starwala. Hope I didn't do the name too bad. Adam's currently a geoscience advisor at Cordax Evaluation Technologies in Calgary. And prior to Cordax, Adam worked as a petrophysicist for NCS Multistage in Halliburton. He has a master's degree in geology from the University of Regina. And with that, I'll turn it over to Adam.
Cool. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you, John, for inviting me to present in this webinar. It's a great opportunity. I really wanted to take a little bit of a different, approach than the other two, and just look at, what is the data that we're ultimately using to, calibrate our models. So that's really kind of the underlying focus and, in what we're talking about here. And where I'd like to start is just, a few. I like to call them thought-provoking questions in the broader picture of petrophysics. And it's an interesting thing being working in the consultant space and seeing how different operators are structured and how they do different things. And one of the questions that I have for people is, why do some companies replace a lot of value in petrophysics and others do not? And examples I could give you are, here in Calgary, there's 300,000 BOE a day companies that, do not have a petrophysicist on staff. And, there's, 60,000 barrel a day companies that have 3 that are drilling one asset. So there's, widely different, value propositions in different organizations. Another thought is, how do we increase the value in our organizations? How can we provide data that, the rest of our team can make more robust business decisions with? And, kind of tying that together is, what is the uncertainty in our work? So objectives, discussion points, kind of want to start with how are our teams ultimately using our data? And really it's driving, this one's more driving down to making decisions about where to put wells, well spacing, that type of information. I'm going to briefly talk about, the differences between deterministic, probabilistic, and statistical models, just, so everyone's all on the same page. We're going to discuss core. And finally, we're going to talk about uncertainty in multi-well studies. So I guess, how is our data being used? So this was an eye-opening experience for me a number of years ago. They're taught in the early days of, petrophysics was delivering, single porosity, single saturation over an interval, and, there you go. And, kind of the eye-opening experience was seeing that, our reservoir engineers are ultimately using our data to make, forecasts, and their forecasts, P10, P90, P50, with different ranges of, pressure, porosity, saturation, and the probability of success at different price decks. And, this, my first exposure to this was gas, single phase models, analytic, easy stuff, Flair, Willerich type things up here in Canada. And, as we progressed, the team that I was on, we kept moving, forward. And as software became better and, computation speed sped up, we're able to start looking at things like volatile oil, gas condensate. This example here is from the Eagleford. Obviously not the Carnes or DeWitt, areas, but you're able to start, driving into pretty good, ratios or, forecasting methods and determining success. And I think, the eye-opening component was just that, how many variables are actually going into forecasting, and, really just that our teams are craving, a realistic understanding of what the uncertainty is. So we can change things like well length, permeability, if we're looking at things like porosity. So what are the ranges over our acreage? What are ranges in, water saturation? And, even in that, one of the other big takeaways for me was, once, learning about these simulation models, is that they are really working in the effective porosity space. So it became kind of a challenge in relating, the classic workflows and, dealing with total porosity, and how do I deliver meaningful property distributions for effective water saturation, effective porosity, and permeability, which we're going to, talk about in a little further detail. So, in 3 slides, I'm really going to, take regional petrophysics and the 3 ways you can do it and kind of simplify it. And, these equations here, the point is not getting, too lost in it. It's really just to say that, the math exists in most common software now to do a quite good job of simultaneously solving for both flush zone saturation and total and effective porosity, if we want to. Where they fall apart is if we really, go through the math, we see that there isn't really components for kerogen, and there's not really components for bitumen. So when we start looking at self-sourced reservoirs where we're having very variable amounts of kerogen and bitumen, and we want to include that in our analysis, well, we're having to go to kind of a multi-step scenario. And this can get tricky, especially if we want to, look at the uncertainty in it. This is, the underlying math. I think it's, the same equations for the density models in both TechLog and Geolog. And both of those software packages do a very good job of allowing us to, address, uncertainty in our values like salinity, AM, and N. But, that it's that second piece. If we have to do another set of equations to it, how do we pass that uncertainty modeling through it? Probabilistic or stochastic models, if we really want to get, down to the nuts and bolts, they're all some derivation of, this equation here. And ultimately what we're dealing with is just logs that have input values. We're calculating volumes, and then we're using those volumes to recalculate our input logs, and we're trying to minimize the incoherence between the two. So they're hugely more flexible than the deterministic models. And one of the main advantages to it is that we can kind of do a one-step uncertainty analysis for all of our inputs, and we can include kerogen and bitumen in that analysis. So it's a much neater process. The challenge with it, though, is it can become very computationally expensive and time-consuming. And for those that haven't seen it, I mean, this is from TechLog, just showing, all the different even pre-populated mineral volumes that we can ultimately select. So they come from the software vendors with, a huge amount of, choices, and we can add more, so. And it's also a lot easier to make, step-by-step changes in them if we so choose. I think the third one, and the one that I'm finding most interesting, are the statistical methods, linear, nonlinear, neural networks. And I think, it's been interesting to me to see over the last few months, we've been working with a few clients that are going down the road now of using neural networks to model porosity across their acreage. And that's a very interesting, concept to me. I'm very comfortable with the idea of, using these types of workflow for permeability. It's just eye-opening to see that people are taking it to a totally different path than I think what's classically been done, And one of the reasons for it might just be, it's the software to go and, go down this road is a lot cheaper than getting a fully populated, Petrophysics piece of software. So that could be one component. And I'm going to talk about this a bit more in a moment. So our next thing I really want to get into is just what is the relationship between core regionally and how we calibrate our model. So I'm going to talk about the rock. The rock is really, where it all starts with and where it all ends, and how do we calibrate. And in regional models, where it can get very challenging is, we're often dealing with data that comes from, disparate sources. Up here in Canada, we have very good, public data, but we're looking at core analysis that, could be many years old. We may not understand or have the data. What type of mud did they run? Were they able to do it, underbalanced, or was it overbalanced? What were the handling procedures? Or it comes from a data trade where, we just don't have, the information or an understanding of what the workflow was. So I think we really have to be, pretty pragmatic when looking at this information and really ask ourselves, is it really the ground truth we think it is? And if we're suspecting it's not, does it make sense to calibrate our models to it, or do we need to kind of take a different approach? I'm going to start with saturation because it's been the most eye-opening, example for me. And I'm going to start here. This is a Haynesville, project I had the opportunity to work on. I think this is about 4 years ago. I'm going to walk everyone through the tracks, but just to, the Haynesville I would put up there with the Vaca Muerta. It's probably the most complicated, reservoirs that I've worked on petrophysically. We're dealing with, high clay volumes, both illite and chlorite. We're dealing with pretty high kerogen volumes. And in this example, we had, it's a Schlumberger log suite. So we had spectroscopy, NMR, and a quad combo with it, and core. And this core was, it's Dean Stark. Total Porosity is, that particular lab that excels in that is the company that did the work. And I built this model before we really dove into production. And the tracks we're looking on here on the left, this is total porosity. And, if everyone can kind of hone in on the black points, that's our total core porosity. And that's the orange band is representing 1 sigma or a property distribution and uncertainty in a Monte Carlo model. The next track is effective porosity. This track here is flushed zone water saturation, which I was trying to use the core total water saturations to calibrate to that. This here is our effective water saturation, which I'm going to come back to. And then finally, our grain density. And I really focused in this case on, trying to match the grain density most, because I didn't think there was any bitumen in this case. I thought that was the most representative core data piece as compared to the porosities and the water saturations. And really the takeaway from this and the uncertainty analysis is there really wasn't a way that I could bend or break this model with realistic assumptions for or for salinity, Archie, AM and N, CEC, and really put any, free water or effective water saturation into this model at all. So, this analysis kind of indicated that we're at, that 5% or even less effective water saturation. So I passed it on to our reservoir engineering team. We started looking at the production data, and here's, that very same well, or this was the pilot, or the logs were from the pilot, and this was the horizontal. And we're looking at, water gas ratio and condensate gas ratio. And, the CGR, I hope, everyone's seeing there, it's, it's quite low. We're in that, 10 barrels a million type range. This is a 9,000 pound reservoir. So I think we're pretty comfortable in saying we're in single phase, flow for gas for the entire, production plot we're looking at here. And really the interesting piece is if we look at WGR, we see that it's decreasing through time. We're producing, or we think this is relatively the end of load fluid recovery. And then we're seeing WGR start to increase. And what that's really kind of pointing to, we think, is that, we have an effective water saturation in here, and that we're ultimately producing free fluid from the reservoir. So again, it's a dry gas reservoir with, just water and gas. So I guess one of the questions then becomes, how can we, or is those water saturations that I calculated, are they indicative? And it really matters when we start looking at things like OGIP, recovery factor, things like that. And we went into, a production model, and, early time, we neglected the early time water flow back, thinking that was load fluid. And later on, to try and get a reasonable match to water, using, a numerical model, we really had to crank water saturation up to 60% if we, keep relative permeability curves, kind of at their default range, which we thought in this case was pretty realistic. So I guess the eye-opening component, for me from this is really just that, I can take this core data, I can take this water saturation, and I can build a pretty robust model to match it, but it's not reconciling with what the production data is doing. So how do I, which one's correct? Do I want to bet the farm on the core, or am I going to let the wellhead kind of dictate it? And we dove into it a little bit further. For those that are familiar with it, in the Haynesville, beneath it, you have the Smackover, which is a pretty water wet carbonate. And then, the Bossier above it. And when we did the frac modeling work, it was really, kind of pointed us to, there was no way we could really bend or break that model to show that we would have penetration into either of those units. So it was kind of, we couldn't reconcile at that point where the water was coming from. And it really just made me, think about, and going forward from this point, how much value can we really place on water saturation from core? This is a Bakken example up in Saskatchewan here in Canada. So this is, so everyone's familiar. This is a migrated, it's migrated oil for sure. The shales here are not mature. So we're looking at oil that's came from likely North Dakota and migrated up dip, in the order of a couple 100 miles. And this analysis was done, it was a routine core analysis, and we have, the logs where we have as received bulk density, we have porosity, and we have these permeability measurements, and then we have our water and oil saturations from core. I guess the next, problem we need to consider when we're looking at regionally, modeling and calibration is this issue around missing saturations in core. It may be a little less problematic in, a lot of the modern core analysis where we have an unconventional reservoirs, but if we're starting to look at older core analysis and, more conventional or fringe type plays, what do we choose to be the fluid that we have in that space, or what's the missing volume? And I think we would be pretty comfortable in saying in the middle Bakken that this is likely water wet. There's not really any kerogen in the middle component or in the reservoir. So we're missing, in places 60% of the volume, and how do we reconcile that? I'd really, suggest everyone, if in their reading, if they're bored, to go after the Blunt et al. Papers from Shell, where they spend a lot of, or do a really good analysis of explaining how different labs are looking at, or in their analysis, they're missing volume. Some are saying that it's water, some are saying that it's hydrocarbon, and it really just, makes it challenging when you're not, part of that process as to where do you actually calibrate, or how do you calibrate your data. So, if we go to the production and look at it, this is it's a pretty good well. This well ultimately cumed, I think it was 130,000 barrels of oil. These are cheap, under $2 million completions, but we're dealing with, water oil ratios of 2. So we're producing essentially 2 barrels of oil for every barrel or 2 barrels of water for every barrel of oil. So in that, looking at these curves, are we comfortable in saying 50% water saturation is enough when we likely have, a 30% irreducible water saturation in effective space? Or, is it all oil we lost, or is it all water? And it makes it, quite challenging to reconcile. Finally, in the saturation space, this was another very eye-opening one for me. So this is a Montney example. It's quite deep. We're looking at a well that's 3,500 meters deep, so over 11,000 feet. We know from other methods that we're in the 100 nanodarcy perm range, and it's dry gas. Over the first year, it's 13,000 barrels of condensate it's produced, and BCF of gas with essentially no water. So, we're not really getting any load fluid back at all. And when we look at the core data, we know this was this was a retort type analysis, and we know in this case that the plugs were cut, vertically in the center of the core where there should be the least amount of invasion. And, the offsetting production is pretty strongly indicating to us that we should be expecting, dry gas. And we're seeing in places of this, or of the core analysis, we're seeing up to, 40% oil saturation in the data. So this is really, pointing to, and this is an effective space, I should highlight that. So this is really pointing to, in the center of the core plug, that we're having, a significant amount of, mud invasion or invert. And where it gets challenging, if we look at, this is a Schlumberger PEX log suite. This is the RXO measurement. So, it's essentially flatlining. So in this case, we didn't have a really good, invaded zone measurement. We know that, where our density tools reading, we likely have oil-based mud invading, and we had to use the 10-inch depth of investigation from the AIT tool to kind of build our flush zone model. And I guess the question that we have looking at this is, what did we displace? Did we displace water, or did we displace gas, or did we displace both? And when I built this model, I made the assumption, and it's in this track here when looking at water saturation, that the invert there, or we're basically calibrated assuming that the invert displaced gas. That may not be totally correct. We're likely looking at a mixed wettability system here, where we have some amount of kerogen. We likely have some amount of kerogen, porosity, some bitumen. So we likely have a mixed wettability system, and this may not be a good assumption. So that can lead us down the road of using this data to having a pretty appreciable error in how much OGIP we would likely have in this case. Rock mechanics. Rock mechanics is very interesting. We're often, in my experience, we're getting data that comes in tabular form. We're getting an Excel spreadsheet. We don't often get the stress strain curves for the analysis. And it can make it very problematic, in taking this data for, Young's modulus, Poisson's ratio, shear modulus, all the moduli we're using to build a model. And this was a very eye-opening experience for me. This came from a shale gas reservoir in Europe. I had the opportunity to do some consulting work on. And they cut the core plugs, they were vertically again through the center. And the lab that, did this analysis, the way they did the test, they did them on, a lot of fractured samples, or samples with pre-existing fractures. And when they, ran the triaxial measurements, the planes of weakness are the pre-existing fractures in place. And what that means is we're likely not seeing from these stress strain measurements an accurate representation of the mechanical properties of the rock. And if we don't have, whether it's the photos or the stress strain plots, we'll never know. And in my experience, this is often the case when we're looking at, regional models and getting data from other sources. This was another, interesting one in the Montney. This was, a case up in BC. So it was triaxial stress test measurements again. It was, a lot of money was spent on this. This was, I'll say it, these samples were sent down to Utah. So I think what most would consider to be the premier, lab in the world of geomechanics for oil and gas, at least. And, we calculated, the Young's modulus here in green from compressional shear and bulk density. And these red points are the core values. And this is the Poisson's ratio. And this was another kind of very large challenge, to wrap my mind around. We're getting this data and we're expecting that, the dynamic moduli, or those that we're calculating from the log, should be, equal to or greater than what the triaxial data is pointing to. And, kind of one of the questions from this is really, well, why is this happening? And if we can't explain it, should we be, really using this data to calibrate to our models? And in the rock mechanics data, it's even more kind of critical because this data is a lot more difficult to come by. You see porosity and saturation, those are kind of, the standards, but good, true triaxial stress test data is very difficult to come by. And, the experience has taught me to be, pretty skeptical of them. Core perm, this is an interesting question too. I've through my career, I've been very fortunate to work with some truly world-class reservoir engineers, and what we found is that often in comparing core permeability to production data, it becomes very difficult to relate the two. And this is a great example that came from Chris Clarkson's team in 2016, where they just looked at different ways of calculating core permeability and the different values we can expect to see. And by the time this all shakes out, really what I'm pointing to here is that likely none of these core data points can be used to really truly represent what's going on with production data. Either some of them have microfractures in them, or we're not dealing with the relative permeability of the fluids we're trying to produce, or there's sample contamination, or they're not cleaned properly and preservation's an issue. And it just becomes very challenging to take these core measurements from disparate sources and really relate them into the production data and allow us to make a business decision from them. Bitumen and kerogen. This is a sample from the Lower Bakken Shale in North Dakota. And when looking at it under plain light, well, this is cross-polarized light, but we have both bitumen, kerogen, and pyrite in here. And this is often the case in a lot of the somewhat mature unconventional oil reservoirs we're looking at. And there's something I think that's often lost on a lot of people when we look at this, and that's the transition from kerogen ultimately to oil. And we'll start off with kerogen type 1, type 2, type 3. They're all different, and then through the process, the first thing that we're actually forming is usually bitumen, and that bitumen is soluble, but we have different components in it, asphaltenes all the way to aromatics. And what that means is that when we're cleaning the core and we have bitumen, different solvents are going to give us different answers for where they're going to pull different compounds from it. And then if we keep heating or raising the temperature of it, we'll start breaking the resins, we can start breaking the asphaltenes, and ultimately make lighter hydrocarbons and gas. So what does that look like? Well, this is a great paper that was done on a kerogen-rich reservoir in Brazil. So we're starting with a high amount of kerogen, and as we start going through the catagenesis window, we're making bitumen. So the kerogen volume is actually shrinking, the bitumen volume is increasing, and as we keep increasing temperature, bitumen volume gets higher and higher until it starts breaking down. And then we're, ultimately generating oil, and we're ultimately generating gas. So why does this matter? I guess, most of the people here are going to ask. What it really means is that when we're looking at, oil-rich reservoirs or unconventional reservoirs and we're crossing different PBT windows or different areas of, thermal maturity, we need to clean the rock differently. And the way we clean it and what solvents we're using are actually affecting our grain density values from core and the porosity measurements we're getting from core. So if we don't understand this, those core data points we're using to calibrate can be appreciably off. So if that's true, how do we build a model or a regional scale petrophysical model to reconcile that? So points on core. I mean, it's easy, to look at it and say I'm kind of poo-pooing core. It's the reality is we need it to calibrate for a quality analysis, but it's very challenging to take legacy data or data from other operators and use it without strong care and attention. And we really need to ask ourselves, and have a good understanding of where it came from, what decisions were made, and should we be using it, in our analysis. Uncertainty, this is, with that, we have a lot of uncertainty in the core, but we also have a lot of uncertainty as, the previous folks have talked about in tool responses. We're a lot of times guessing on, AM and N. It's very rare that we actually even see these. Water salinity is, a guess at best. PVT can be very difficult. And what I mean by that is what is the density of the hydrocarbon in the reservoir? The Wolfcamp's a great example where you can go from, volatile oil down to retrograde condensate and switch again, and crossing 3 different intervals within it. So that matters to a petrophysicist because we're having to make assumptions on our fluid densities. talked about kerogen. Clay densities can become very challenging too. There's interesting points around density of clays, especially when you look at, illite. There's depending upon the temperature, you can go from smectite, illite to mica, and as you increase the temperature, you're driving water off. So if we have enough temperature variation across, a regional model, we should be expecting that our dry densities for our clays should be changing as well. So that's my points there. So really just from here, I think when we get to regional models, it's really just understanding that we have a lot of uncertainty and to embrace it and to understand what it is and to move to a world where we're building our models to address what that uncertainty is. And, I kind of commented on it earlier. I think from my opinion, at least, it can be very challenging to do that with deterministic models, especially in kerogen and bitumen-rich reservoirs. I think the stochastic or probabilistic models can do a better job of it. And it's really important that we build models that accurately capture what our range and uncertainties actually are. I think if we're honest with ourselves from core data and we were to say, total porosity is 8%, I think most people would be pretty comfortable in saying, well, the mean may be, that number, but maybe it's plus or minus, 1.5 porosity units on each side for what that range can be. And with that understanding, how does that affect our volumes in our place and allow us to make better business decisions on well placement? And this is just an example. So this is an example from the Lewis and Mesa Verde that I did a couple of years ago. And it's really just highlighting the fact that, we can go into building, field scale probabilistic models where we can address ranges in, porosity, both total and effective water saturation and grain density. It can definitely be done. This is an example from the Wolf Camp, same sort of comment. We can definitely go down that road. Same idea. It's a little more challenging in the Wolf Camp than, in the Lewis, example I gave before, just due to much wider distribution of mineralogy, distribution in fluid densities, and distribution in maturity, but it can be done. So just final thoughts, from my opinion, at least, I think, as the probabilistic models become faster and more capable of uncertainty, I think they're really going to become the preferred method in this type of analysis. I think core is required, but I think we also need to be strong enough in saying that the information that we're getting from it can be suspect and that we, need to be careful in how we use it. Those choosing to statistically model a whole field based upon core are, I think, really, in for a bad position long term. So what I mean by that is just using, neural network modeling or, whatever, or a random forest or whatever, and just using those methods with log data to calculate porosity and permeability. I think people who choose to go down that road are definitely a lot more prone to error than, the other two methods. And just as a final thought, in this, the cutoffs really have a place in fractured low permeability reservoir petrophysics. And it's interesting in what the other folks have talked about in the distribution between, porosity. Some of it's in the organic, some of it's in intergranular. We're dealing with different amounts of, irreducible water saturation from none to high. So how do we really look at things like a porosity or saturation cutoff to define if we're going to have, economic success in a well? So that's my talk. Thank you guys for your time. And I guess questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Adam. Very good. Very good. I guess the first question from the audience, core uses an indicator of relative differences of permeability from one section of the well to the next, not an absolute. I compute permeability from production analysis, and I use a Lorentz plot to split into layers. What do you think of that method?
I think, one of the comments on, I would say, at least from core, is really just, to really understand that it's facies based, and it really is difficult to do a meaningful job calculating it from logs. After that, I mean, it gets into a really deep, dark hole of, there's different ways of doing it. I'm personally of the camp that the most valuable piece of permeability to me is, after closure radial flow analysis from a DFIT. My experience has taught me, in looking at reservoirs essentially all over the world, that is usually the closest, permeability estimate that actually represents production. And I've, seen a lot of data from core where it gets very challenging to use and understand where it came from. And it just, it can be orders of magnitude off, and it becomes at that point, do you do a data transform, or how does it relate?
Exactly. I mean, we have one in our last paper. We had 100 nanodarcies as received, and the DFIT was 27,000 nanodarcies. So, I think you have a little bit of difference in production. Yeah, go ahead.
One thing I would say is that, if one has the opportunity to do an interference test on, producing wells, it really can do a good job very quickly of kind of limiting that bandwidth on what, a whole bulk reservoir permeability can be. And I think that with the DFIT can really point you in the right direction, where getting lost in individual core measurements can be quite problematic.
Yeah, and a lot of these reservoirs, if you use the core perm without trying to go some kind of SRV perm, you're going to get some really goofy answers as well. It looks like these rocks won't flow.
Yep.
Yeah, one comment on your rock mechanics. Bob Barbae had an interesting observation on that with the core rock mechanics. Is why do people try to do rock mechanics on cores if they still believe in inelastic stream recovery as a valid technique for estimating fracture azimuth? The whole concept of ASR is that the rock is going to expand and crack and break.
Well, and that's a good point. It certainly does. Like, how can we realistically think that we can pull a piece of rock that's, under 9,000, 10,000 PSI of confining stress up to surface and not expect to have a pretty meaningful change to it?
Exactly. Unless you find some magic Humpty Dumpty super glue, that might. Let's see if there's any other questions here. One more question, Adam. When we worked the oil shell project, we had a really good success with the NMR tool, with Harold Vinegar and the guys there. I've had mixed results in organics. So what's your experience been with NMR? I mean, in theory, it ought to be a pretty decent tool since it doesn't see the kerogen, but what have you all come across on that?
My experience with NMR is that I love the concept, but practically it's very difficult to make it work in unconventional rocks. Like, when I was at Halliburton going through, the classes on it, what became very apparent to me very quickly is that without good core analysis and really calibrating your NMR model, like to benchtop NMR, how do you even design the acquisition program? And there ends up being a lot of challenges to it. Truthfully, it's in practice for me, it's often in an unconventional reservoir, I seldomly use it. I'm more inclined to use spectroscopy. I like driving my models with grain density from a spectroscopy tool, and I'm much more comfortable with the outputs I'll get from that versus NMR. But that's, even in that, spectroscopy and a dielectric measurement, I think can get us a lot further, usually for a cheaper cost than what NMR can. But that's just an opinion.
Sure. Excellent. Are there any questions for any of the panelists from the group? This is a good time to go ahead and open it up to the general questions from all three. We've heard all three talks, plus the introduction. Does anything else come to mind that needs some more clarification?
Yeah, Bob, maybe I'll kick things off here while people are thinking. So, and this goes out to not just the panelists, but maybe the audience as well can chime in on the chat. When you think about, as an industry, where we've got it wrong, and when I say gotten it wrong, I mean we've ineffectively predicted production performance, either over or under. How much of the time, just looking back at your experience, does this go back to not an adequate understanding of the petrophysics, or some assumptions made on the petrophysics side that later proved to be false?
Yeah, good question. Any thoughts from the panelists?
I tend to always blame the petrophysicist. It doesn't work. The next in line is the geologist, because it's never off. like the examples I gave, right, in terms of saturation, that is an important one. And as Adam mentioned, water saturation is a very critical, right? And then the perm, if those two are wrong, then it's typically, it's, yeah.
Yeah, I think to add something to that, I think a lot of the issues there, Dylan, that we see is that if you don't have that feedback loop, like what we used on Jorge's paper and really on the stuff that we do, we compare routinely EURs from OIPs and come up with recovery factors that work. If you don't have a way to independently validate the petrophysics, a lot of times, it's really not a very good estimate. But if you do have a feedback loop, even in like water cut, where we looked at in Jorge's paper, or just actual EURs from oil reservoirs that we look at all the time, that can really weaken the effectiveness of the petrophysics. But if you can get a good tie with that feedback loop, which surprisingly a lot of people don't do.
Yeah, one thing we've done, we built so many neural networks to try to always make a case that our reservoir characterization indeed correlates well to production. And we used to do that all the time and sort of use it as the sole purpose of, we know what we're talking about, right? However, when we started building the physical models, right, the production models in dynamic simulators, we saw that, a neural network is not a physical model, right? It's not really tied to any sort of physics. It's just tied to some sort of regression factors, right, that enable a match. But ultimately, we do have to be physically consistent, right? I mean, we can't just fool ourselves that we made the right connection. So this is why, it's always kind of good to get back to, does the actual rock, through physically consistent modeling, explain the result instead of deceiving ourselves a bit.
But he said.
Excellent. One more question. In the Middle East fractured gas reservoir with low matrix porosity, we really struggled to get OGIP. In this case, petrophysics dominated the results. It's an observation, I guess, right? Not really a question, is it? I guess it's more of an observation. But yeah, in general, I think the consensus is petrophysics is not used to its full potential in a lot of cases. And I think some of the stuff we've done today is really a good indication of what you need to do to try and get it where it's more useful and more meaningful and more mainstream. It's definitely been a stepchild in a lot of cases, but when used properly, you can eliminate a lot of the surprises that we see out there.
Yeah.
There's a lot of surprises coming at people these days. They're only good for birthday parties, I think.
So I think we're at time here. I may just go a little bit over just to wrap up here. First of all, I wanted to thank all of the presenters and the attendees for joining today. You might have been able to tell from my question that I have a personal opinion on that. And, as I like to think of myself as a reservoir engineer anyways. One of the most important factors is, forgive me, geologists, but the size of the box that we're dealing with when it comes to the reservoir. And I mean hydrocarbons, I think that a lot of the times, we've, myself guilty, has taken petrophysics for granted, just kind of accepted the numbers that are given. And then going forward, I find out that the numbers don't make sense and I have to go back. So the feedback loop, I totally agree, Bob, is important. And, you guys are the experts on this, so appreciate that. I wanted to quickly just remind you all, if you're not subscribed to our mailing list yet, if you want to hear more about these webinars, make sure you don't miss one. In general, just hear about some of the content we're putting out on SAGA Wisdom. I encourage you to go to our website. So here you'll be able to actually contact us, and there's a little checkbox to subscribe to our newsletter. That'll get you in contact with our community, and you'll make sure you don't miss one of these. The other thing I did want to shamelessly promote is Cameron Snow has a course currently on SAGA Wisdom site. It's actually the largest course we have right now. So I've got a lot of work to do over Christmas, Cam, to get through this. But I wanted you to go and take a look at that, sagawisdom.com. Cam's done an amazing job of putting this together. There's quizzes, there's practical applications. This should take you from 0 to hero pretty quickly. If you are interested in subscribing to this, you can subscribe here individually, or you can contact us if you're looking to subscribe a team. Again, I wanted to thank everyone today, and hopefully we'll get up this recording out to you guys soon.